Hello, everyone. My name is Brian Reed from NowSecure. I'm the Chief Mobility Officer, and I'll be your host and moderator today. I'd like to thank everybody for joining us. As I look here, we have a number of people logging in right now, and as is our tradition, we're going to wait about a minute or two to get everybody a chance to join so that everybody can hear the full content. So again, hang on tight. We've got a few dozen people on now. We're expecting more, and we see people continuing to join. So we'll get started in about 60 to 90 seconds. Thanks, everyone. Hello, once again, this is Brian Reed here from NowSecure. Thanks for joining us today. We have a number of people joining us today, and we have a large crowd expected, so we're going to give people plenty of time to get in. As is our tradition, we'll wait about 1 to 2 minutes after start time for everybody to join, and then we'll get rolling. So we'll get going in 30 to 60 seconds. Thanks again for joining. Okay, it's time to get rolling. Once again, my name is Brian Reed. I'm the Chief Mobility Officer here at NowSecure, and I'm excited to be your moderator and host for today's webinar, our last webinar of 2017 as we look to 2018. Today's webinar is 5 mobile app security must-dos for 2018, and it features our renowned mobile security experts and book authors, Andrew Hoog and Katie Strzemka. I'll be your host along with our two presenters today, and before we get rolling, I have just a few notes to begin. So as a reminder, because you're attending this webinar live, we are entering you to win a free mobile app security report from the App Store or the Play Store of your choice. And so we'll be talking a bit today about third-party app risk, and one of you lucky winners will get a free analysis of the app of your choice. Today's session will include a presentation and Q&A at the end. You can ask a question at any time using the Ask Question tab on your BrightTalk webinar screen. Enter these questions as they occur to you, and then we'll be collecting all of the questions and answer them at the end. We find it simplest to handle all the questions at the end. In addition, today's presentation will be recorded, and everyone will get a follow-up email that will include a link to the recording and a link to the slides. Lastly, at the end, you'll see a rating section on your BrightTalk screen. Please rate today's presentation. It helps us make sure that we are providing the most information, relevant, helpful content to you. Now, in terms of background, NowSecure has been in the space since 2009. We started in mobile forensics, and in fact, our speakers today, Andrew and Katie, literally wrote the books on mobile forensics for iOS and Android. And over the years, we've built out a strong threat research team, and it's a core part of our DNA. And as our researchers and our services and security practitioners have operated in the market this past year, they've developed a key set of recommendations that we want to share with people as they plan for 2018. Our mission really is to keep the world safe from unsafe mobile apps. So we're trying to take care of everyone in terms of the internal apps you develop as well as the third-party App Store apps you and your employees might be downloading. So today we're serving as education. We're going to give you some information, some insights that you may not be aware of, and then provide you some best practices, guidelines of things you should be considering for next year, including long-term strategies as well as immediate actions that you might want to take advantage of. Now, if you want to stay in touch with the latest news, we recommend you subscribe to our MobSec 5. You can go to the URL that you see here. That's a weekly email delivered to your inbox with the latest in mobile security vulnerabilities, issues, strategies, and best practices. So we have tens of thousands of subscribers. We encourage you to subscribe to that as well, and that way you can be certain that if you're worried about mobile app security, you'll get that latest information every week from our subscription. So as we look today at our agenda, we're going to be covering, a year in review, and I'm going to give you some background and summarize a couple of the major events of this year. And then we're going to hand it over, and Andrew and Katie are going to tag team on the mobile AppSec must-dos. So first, I'd like to introduce Andrew, NowSecure founder.
Hey, Brian, thanks. It's great to be on the call today and kind of reflect back on 2017 and what we're looking forward to in 18. So this will be a great session, and hopefully we'll get some good questions from folks. Katie and I love to kind of interact with what's top of mind for each one of you guys, so I encourage you to ask questions along the way.
And then, Katie, would you like to introduce yourself as well?
Absolutely. Thanks, Brian. Hi, everyone. I'm Katie Strumka, and I run services and customer success for NowSecure. Among other things, my team tests mobile applications on a daily basis, and we also like to help guide our customers as they're developing their internal mobile AppSec programs. I'm excited to be here and talk with you all about mobile security trends and how they relate back to our everyday analysis.
All right, so with our speakers introduced, I'd like to kind of roll into a little bit of summary of the year. In review, we had some major events happen across the security, vulnerability, privacy, and compliance vectors. And so if we look at those as a starting point, right, there's at least a half a dozen serious security vulnerabilities that happened this year. You know, they spanned everything from the bootloader to Broadpwn and the Wi-Fi chips, all the way over to Bluetooth, and of course, millions and millions of organizations were impacted by Cloudbleed, which also impacted applications in mobile AppSec as well, largely due to third-party libraries. So every year we continue to face new vulnerabilities. While the platforms get stronger, AppSec gets better. The reality is that mobile, because of its end-to-end connectivity and its inherent nature, will be at risk to vulnerabilities probably forever at the rate we're going. Now, when we look at the privacy perspective, again, there were a number of privacy dumps this year that are pretty scary, whether you look at the, Uber tracking information or, the BART was collecting data about personal information through its security apps. And so we're seeing privacy as a growing risk vector, and in fact, we'll talk about that as one of the key compliance trends driving forward, which is now we've had some new compliance mandates rolling out. For many of you who are in financial services, the new New York cybersecurity requirements, hit in August of this year. We have many customers we've helped deal with that. And more importantly, and especially scary from a penalty perspective, is Gdpr, which takes effect at the beginning of next year. And I think we'll be talking a little bit more about Gdpr because it's probably the largest privacy and compliance wave to hit businesses, IT, and AppSec teams in years. And so that'll clearly be on everybody's agenda for the next year. So vulnerabilities, privacy, compliance. We, of course, have major platform updates, right? So we have new technologies emerging, things like, Face ID. Clearly, it's an interesting new kind of authentication. Will it be as strong as past authentication? Organizations have come to trust Touch ID and that series of technologies that have been well vetted. So we'll see how this new kind of authentication evolves. iOS 11 has added a lot of new features. Some might say that it is also backstepped in some areas around security. Android 8 has advanced and backstepped both. And so while the mobile operators, the mobile operating system vendors and hardware vendors continue to improve security, they also continue to make user-friendly features that in turn could be exploited by the bad guys and potentially risked depending on how the devices and applications and services are configured. So when we look at it overall, this is a very interesting graphic. We've been building out this inside the mobile attack surface for years here at NowSecure, and every year the list gets longer and longer, whether they're data at rest or data in motion or code-level functionality or back end. And so as the mobile attack surface evolves, we all need to stay, as AppSec professionals, we need to stay up to speed on what these new ones are and leverage third parties and experts like NowSecure to make sure we're up to date on these, leverage technologies to make sure that we're covered and not exposed to any risk during those cycles. And so with all that in mind and with the setup for a great conversation here through our top 5 for next year, we're going to go ahead and why don't we go ahead and answer a first question that came in. Normally we answer at the end, but I hit the Face ID topic. So is Face ID more of a secure authentication method or not? Should we figure out how to use it in our app? Should we be concerned about our devices with Face ID? I'll throw that one to Andrew, who I think is taking a look at this with our research team.
Yeah, so it's great to get some interaction already. So I think, we work a lot with large banking customers, and they tend to be early adopters on technologies, especially technologies that improve security and usability. And so Touch ID was something that, I almost forgot what it was like when Touch ID first came out, but there was a rush of interactions with our banking customers. There's always people out there trying to figure out if you can defeat it. And as you know, there were some pretty high profile cases of, where you could essentially defeat Touch ID. And so, one of the strategies that we see from large enterprises is investigate the technologies early, but typically kind of a slow or slight delay in terms of implementation. With the larger banking apps, you want to take advantage of the latest features because some of your best customers are the folks that are on the cutting edge of technology. But at the same time, iOS and Apple in general, they've really stumbled over the past couple of months with some botched security implementations. You could log in as root with no password on iOS 10, on macOS. They rolled out an update and then overrode it again. There's been a number of security patches in iOS 11 as well since it's come out. So the long story short, if somebody's sitting here evaluating it is I would say that it's a technology to take a close look at. Touch ID took a few years to take off, but has really changed how consumers interact with your applications in a positive way, and they've maintained effective security. But I do have some reservations personally around more and more of our data that we can't change, so our fingerprints, our face IDs, et cetera, becoming our main authentication mechanism. So I have some personal reservations. There's some security and technology reservations, but Apple has consistently shown they can push the edge and develop new technologies. And so I think it's one that ought to be on your roadmap for evaluating. I wouldn't implement it, in Q1 of 18. So Katie, I don't know if you have any other input from customer conversations or any other things to share on Face ID as you see it?
Yeah, I think the only other additional point I'd want to add is that really any new method, especially as it relates to authentication, is secure until it isn't. And you touched on that as well. Face ID took a while to roll out. Touch ID took a while to roll out. And in the beginning, once it did, it wasn't very well known from a testing perspective, from a research perspective. And about a year or so after it was released, there was a not high risk, but there was a flaw that was detected in the local authentication implementation of it. So I think the same way around things like Face ID that are new and coming out. There's always the rush to get those new methods and features integrated into the application without that research up front. And then also just be aware of the fact that even if you do your research, once it comes out, it's only going to be secure until somebody finds a vulnerability for it. And that's the way I think you need to look at a lot of features.
Well, thanks for that on Face ID, right? You're reminding me of the evolution of Touch ID. I, too, forgot how that evolved with the banks when I was working in that space many years ago. So we're going to go through 5 key topics. I'll introduce each topic. Andrew will give us a topic summary and sort of a long-term view, and then Katie will give us some very practical steps to address each of the 5 key topics for the year. And as we looked at next year, probably the biggest thing that has the biggest teeth that could impact any business that does business in the European region is GDPR. There is some hype to it. There is some reality to it. So I'll hand it over to Andrew to get us a look at GDPR from a mobile perspective.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Brian. So, GDPR didn't really hit my radar screen until pretty recently. And so if folks are on the line that are security analysts, developers, et cetera, it might be something that you've heard the acronym but aren't really aware of all the details. So we just put a few key concepts out here, for folks to be able to review. The thing that sticks out from why are people going to pay attention is that the fees are astronomical. I mean, almost indefensible in my opinion, but so you're looking at up to 4% of annual global revenue, or 20 million pounds, or $23 million, which is in the greater of one of those two. So we're talking about massive fines, and the essence is essentially, so this is hitting in mid next year, is that we live in a surveillance society. It's a concept that Bruce Schneier talked about. We see it constantly when we evaluate mobile applications and see how much data they collect or over-collect. And so this regulation is focused on limiting that and making sure that people are aware of it and making sure you have proper security controls in place. And there's a lot of work to be done. From a macro perspective, setting aside the fines and whether or not those things will actually happen, this is probably good news for most folks on the call here for two reasons. One, all of us are consumers, and we know that an enormous amount of our data is getting collected. So this is going to enforce or force companies to reflect on that. And second of all, we've always found that larger organizations tend to have a much more robust security and privacy policy, security testing mechanisms, et cetera. And so there's probably already a certain amount of work that's been done within your organization to limit the data you collect, to know exactly what you collect, to look at what third parties collect. And so this is a really good way to kind of help business teams prioritize objectives that are good for the business, good for the consumer, and really good for security teams. Because now we don't have to jump around and say, hey, we're just saying no, or we're just layering on arduous things. There's real reputational and financial risk here. And so we're going to put a little pause on this and do an assessment of where we're at. And I think that can be very helpful for teams to leverage and communicate the business value to security and privacy. So that's just kind of how I see it from a larger arc. And I'm going to pass it over to Katie, who's going to talk about some things that you guys could do in the shorter term, 2018 starting out, to kind of address some of that risk and provide leadership, if you will, to the business around this. So Katie?
Right. Yeah, from a practical standpoint, within the next quarter, there really are some things that you should either start doing or continue to do to ensure GDPR compliance. One of those is to, from an application security perspective, review your current AppSec testing guidelines and make sure that you have test cases built around or focused on the protection of data at rest and data in transit. So the goal here is to ensure that there's no private personal information that's transmitted over the network without encryption or stored on the device in an easy-to-access location, such as log files or the Android SD card, for example. And that's from the perspective of testing your own internally developed applications. Beyond that, some additional things you can do are review how your organization receives and manages consent as it relates to the data you're collecting within your mobile app. So make sure that within your app, you're completely transparent about what data you're collecting. You're asking users to explicitly give their consent for that data and make sure that you have proof of all of that. Andrew, I'm not sure if there's anything else you have to add to those, but we like to start small here and give you a couple of, here are some things you could do within the next quarter to kind of approach that end goal.
Yeah, I think it's, great advice is always to start small because there's so much to do out there and you can't boil the ocean. So if you take some of those steps that Katie's mentioned, pay particular attention to third-party libraries because those things can track data that you are not necessarily aware of. But if you take some of those initial steps, again, it's not only going to help deal with this business risk, but it puts kind of some DNA, some fundamental concepts and builds into your DNA that these things matter. And I think that's something that can be helpful to increase the business value of security in the organization. So that's that. With that, I would say, well, yeah, go ahead, Brian.
Move on to the next one. So thanks, Andrew and Katie. I think the other interesting thing about GDPR and privacy in general is I think privacy winds up touching all of the other topics we're going to hit on today as privacy requirements and government mandates become more draconian, as it were. And so let's move on into our number 2 topic. And so, as Andrew hinted towards, this third-party risk is out there substantially. And, we are finding more and more mobile developers are using dozens of third-party libraries and in many instances have no idea what those libraries are actually doing with your data. So I'll hand it over to Andrew to tell us the story here.
Yeah, so I already kind of touched on it a little bit, but we really want to emphasize well beyond GDPR that, again, applications tend to be assembled more and more these days versus kind of programmed from the ground up. And that's great news because it means we can build applications faster. And if that code is quality that you're building on top of, then you get to inherit that. And if you look out there, we just try to put some stats in place that would give you a sense for, what the ecosystem is looking like. And so, GitHub has some pretty nice tools out there to look at dependency tracking, and 75% of projects out there have dependencies. So basically nobody's writing applications that aren't using and relying heavily on these third-party libraries and SDKs. And second of all, it was interesting, there was a study published that looked at the number of vulnerabilities in free Android apps stemming from their third-party libraries. And that was pegged at 70%. So that is a huge number. They looked at about 30,000 Android apps. So we basically know that there are vulnerabilities that are emanating from these libraries that's really critical to your application. One of the things that I shared as we were prepping for this webinar is if you go out there and you look at kind of technology leaders, it's always interesting to see things that they're doing and how we could learn from them. And so GitHub, Docker, and Amazon have all very recently introduced services that are continuously scanning the applications or the source code hosted in their systems, looking for third-party vulnerabilities, known vulnerabilities. And so I think that's a really interesting trend for us to reflect on, which is, people are, just like Google with Project Zero, large technology companies are realizing that this entire ecosystem is dependent upon the security of all of its moving parts, and that it's a very expensive and difficult and constantly changing world to keep up with. And so in order to help people make better choices around third-party libraries and whatnot, they're scanning them and looking for flaws in the infrastructure that they run on. So if you upload source code to GitHub and things of that sort using third-party libraries. So I think it's a very interesting trend, and there's some specific things that you can do from a mobile perspective that Katie will walk us through.
Great, yeah, and I'd like to add that in my day-to-day, I've noticed that a lot of people tend to forget about the risk in third-party libraries because they're mostly focused on the code that they're developing. We've tested a lot of applications for our customers where they were doing all the right things and following all of our secure development best practices, but they integrated a third-party SDK that kind of threw all that out the window. So I think the key takeaway here is to make sure that you aren't blindly trusting any third-party components. And we have some steps here that we can spell out on how you can start taking a look internally to see what type of risk you have as it relates to third-party apps in your organization. So to do that, the first step here is to review and document the mobile applications that you develop or have control of, and take inventory of all third-party libraries and SDKs that are in use within these apps. That's step one. Once you have that list, you'll then need to go through and determine whether any of those libraries or specific versions of those libraries include vulnerabilities. One very popular example that I think we all probably remember is the Heartbleed Bug from a few years ago, which was due to a vulnerability in a very specific version of the popular OpenSSL crypto library that was used by many applications. So proactively documenting third-party libraries that are in use would allow your organization to easily query apps that are at risk when a new vulnerability does come out. And that final step, of course, is to make sure your developers are aware of any identified vulnerabilities so that they can take appropriate actions to remediate.
All right, so third-party vulnerabilities, third-party apps, third-party SDK, that's a topic that everyone should be paying attention to if you're not already. NowSecure Technology can help you with that. There are other vendors that can help with inventory information as well. The most important thing is to make sure you're informed, because this has created a whole new vector of risk with mobile using more third-party libraries than pretty much any other technology platform in history. So let's move on to number 3. This was near and dear to my heart. I come from a dev background and development tools in the past. And so the mega trend here around DevOps for cost reasons, for performance reasons, for agility reasons. And DevOps kind of forgot security, and security has still been a bolt-on. So there's a new initiative around shifting left in the development lifecycle called DevSecOps. I'd like to hand it off to Andrew to get us going on the DevSecOps trend with AppSec helping development.
Yeah, thanks, Brian. So one of the things that's really kind of resonated with us is we came across some statistics that pointed out the average kind of developer to AppSec professional ratio. And it was a staggering number, 245 to 1, okay? So my background is security forensics, but frankly, going all the way back, it's as a developer. And so I'm very familiar with and still, code to this day. So I'm thinking about when I build code and I use a whole bunch of third-party libraries, and I'm doing it in modern tool sets, so I can download a couple hundred packages from NPM or something along those lines, right, with a couple of include statements. The amount of work that I generate for a security tester is enormous, and my ability to change that code is enormous. And so the ratio is not only staggering because it's 245 to 1, but because the modern developer today has such an arsenal at their fingertips. So one of the things that was intriguing as I kind of thought through this is that DevOps has allowed us to reduce the deployment cycle. When I used to run web and other technologies for a large healthcare company, we would put out an update once a quarter, and it was a gargantuan effort with hundreds of people. And now people are putting out updates every week to their application. So DevOps has allowed us to enormously accelerate the ability to deploy code. Developers and their tool chains are making enormous amounts of changes, and here we are as security folks with one resource paired up against all of that technology, all of that process, all of that speed. And in the end, it's a really bad deal for security because you basically have two decisions. You either block the code or block the release and do the full security audit and know that there isn't risk to the company, and then everybody's really angry at you. Maybe you find something, maybe you don't. Or you say, I can't keep up, so I'm going to let that one or this one or 5 of them or 10 of them go through. I'm going to occasionally do it. And then everybody's happy until there's a security flaw, and then you're the first person to get thrown under the bus. So there is no way to win based on this trend, which is not going away, unless the security folks can jump on that bandwagon and basically tie into that continuous automated tool chain development. And we're seeing that reflected in the number of apps that are out there in the App and Play Store. So there's an enormous amount of volume. So this is really critical. And Katie's going to kind of take us through a model that helps you guys think through, how can I shift from I'm a security person on a security team up against all these web and mobile apps to how do I plug into some sort of DevSecOps process that can help you guys manage that risk.
Great. And from the perspective of what can or what should you do now in order to begin that shift left process, it's important, again, to point out that you can't tackle it all at once. Rather than fully automating your entire process for all of your internally developed applications, we recommend starting smaller once again, taking one dev team that has interest in automation and taking steps there to make their lives better. So maybe just start with one application for one release and begin to slowly automate that process. Once that's successful, you can then use that as a case study and as an example of a successful workflow that can then be repeated across other teams. And what I think you'll start to see is a lot of benefit across multi-teams there, not just developers. So your security analysts will be very happy because they're no longer going to be fighting that kind of uphill battle. They won't be bogged down with repetitive security testing, having to test every version of every application before it's released. Instead, they're going to be able to focus on diving deeper into more interesting areas of analysis that require their expertise. Another benefit that I think you're going to see here is that your developers will be happier because with this shift, ideally more security issues will be flagged early on in that development process. So instead of security analysts coming back to their devs at the kind of the end of the cycle saying, hey, we found this really high-risk security flaw that needs to be fixed before we go live tomorrow. Those types of issues will be found much earlier to kind of lessen that pressure at the end there. But again, you're going to hear us say this a lot. Don't try and boil the ocean. Start small and build up from there.
Yep, that's great advice, Katie. And I mean, again, we'll constantly underscore this, but with so much happening out there, you find that one person that you can work with, that one app, and make an impact there, and people will come in troves. There was another question that came in, so Brian, I'll just grab that real quick so it's fresh for folks on the topic. And the question was essentially, I'm not going to be able to get my dev team to stop using Crashlytics, even though I can say, look, it collects IMEI or any other sort of data. What should I do? So that's a great point, right? The point to DevSecOps and these third-party libraries is that they're allowing us to operate at speeds that are necessary, that are required. Like we can't keep up with competition and our customers' demand without these types of tools. And Crashlytics is a fantastic library, right? We're running code on other people's smartphones, right? There's 2 billion smartphones out there. When that crashes, it's not like you get something on your web server, you can go look at the logs and figure out what the bug is. So these tools are critically important. And if you go to your development teams and tell them to remove it or ask them to remove it, you're going to lose credibility to them. So I think there are a few specific things that you do. First of all, you need to audit what libraries you are using, and then you need to understand what those libraries are transmitting. Now, that can be a hefty request if a lot of things are changing. At the same time, the way that we do security testing is to do dynamic and behavioral testing on real devices. And the good news about that is that by simply exercising the application, systems, we instrument things so you can actually see what's happening. So you would see that Crashlytics is tracking the IMEI. You don't have to go through their code, static analysis to try to go find it. So there are effective ways of doing that. So first of all, you want to know what's out there. You also want to know if it's on the latest version, because a lot of times these guys are patching different flaws. And so one of the ways you can mitigate some of the risk is to be able to say to the business owners, hey, we're aware of this. We've put an exception in place because of the value that it brings. We're up on the latest version. And we've reviewed the privacy policy of that third-party provider, and it's consistent with the controls that we have or need in place, or we're going to have a conversation with them to make sure we have the right kind of agreement or protections, et cetera. Sometimes third-party libraries mess things up, and they mess up certificate validation. So if Crashlytics ever did that, and you had this continuous testing in place, you want to go back streaming and saying, like, guys, if Crashlytics doesn't fix this and we don't patch it in a day, we're pulling it. Like, we're pulling that library. I don't care if you can see crashes. And at least you would have come back and built a valid case to the business owners and said, look, we understand this is necessary. We feel comfortable with the risk that's involved because of these 7 compensating controls that we have in place. If you need to sign off on some other ones that we're not comfortable with, that's your call. But, hey, we've kind of put it out there and assessed the risk. And then if you ever hit any of those situations that are really just unacceptable, you've already built up credibility with them and saying, like, look, we're on the same team. We're trying to achieve the same goals. We're flexible around these things. But there are certain lines that can't be crossed. And I think that's the best way to approach these things because you have this kind of comprehensive view. It's rational. It's reasonable. It's coming from the same team with the same objectives. And I think developers and business owners can respect that. So hopefully that's some advice that's helpful for the folks that, for the individual that asked that question.
Excellent. So let's continue on. We've been through our first 3, and we're going to go into the next question or the next topic, which is, we've talked a bit, and Katie's talked in each area about, what can we do now, what can we do immediately, and while there's some long-term strategy things, for example, DevSecOps, which could take 6 months to a year to evolve your organization, starting from one person, one team, the entire business. There are a number of low-hanging fruit things that we think you can address. So our 4th topic here in 2018 is addressing low-hanging fruit, and I'll hand that over to Andrew.
Yep. So one of the things that, Katie and I started testing apps back in 2010 when they first, 2009 probably when they first came out. And I sometimes reflect that we haven't had the impact on the industry that I would have hoped because we still see so many apps making mistakes. Now, there's 2 billion smartphones. There's, tens of millions of applications, hundreds of millions, maybe billions of variations of those updates. So it's a pretty ambitious goal. But one of the things, that we share with folks is there are some dead simple things to detect and fix. And if you can go through that list and just tackle some of those items, you're going to eliminate a real demonstrable amount of risk from your applications. And so what we did is we went through our Intel database. Our Intel product is constantly crawling the app in the Play Store. It's running applications through the static, dynamic, and behavioral testing that we've mentioned. And then it puts all of those results into a database. And so it's really powerful because we can learn a lot about what applications are doing and who they're talking to and what data they're transmitting. And so we just kind of queried that, I think, a batch of 30 or 60,000 apps and pulled out some of the most common flaws. And these flaws are so easy to fix. So about three-quarters of Android apps allow world writable or world executable code inside their application. And for anybody that's a little technical on the line, solving it so that an application isn't world writable or world executable is mind-numbingly easy. It's just hang on, click, done. Okay. Now, the platform provides protections, right? So in theory, nobody should be able to take advantage of that if the data is not written to the SD card. Some people write it to the SD card, which is a remote execution, remote code execution flaw, which is a really big problem. But for those of you writing it inside your application directories, there's platform protections in place. But platforms have problems. And so the point is if you guys can go in and make a 5-minute fix that should somebody have should somebody have a jailbroken phone, should a platform have an issue, should some other flaw came out, somebody couldn't use your application against your customers, is that worth it? And obviously we think the answer to that is a very overwhelming, yeah, that's very simple to fix, let's go do that. And there's other similar examples, allowing backups in Android. Somebody can therefore get any data that's cached within your application directory. You have to explicitly deny backups, so they're allowed by default. But it's setting a variable in your manifest file from true to false. And one other one that we'll talk about a little bit is the ATS functionality within iOS apps, which is effectively saying app transport security, which if applications are not going to use secure communications, they have to get an exception to that application. And so they have to flag it in their application transport security, their ATS section. They have to talk about what domains and why, essentially how, what protocols they're using, et cetera. And we're finding that still about a third of iOS apps are filing those exceptions. And, in a day and age where Let's Encrypt now does automated TLS certificates for free, we think we're really getting to a point where it's not really acceptable to be transmitting any sort of data over HTTP anymore. And so these are just examples of some very low-hanging fruit that can show value to the business. It can protect your customers, and it can begin to create that culture of security that is so critical to incubate and show value and cultivate within your team and within your company. So Katie will walk us through a couple of specific ways that you guys can do that in the near term.
Sure, and I think the key here is to start somewhere. As Andrew mentioned, back in 2009, almost 10 years ago now, testing your own apps used to be pretty manageable, right? Maybe you only had a couple internally that you were focused on, and so you didn't have to worry too much about scale. But now we're talking to folks that are dealing with significant app volumes. They're overwhelmed, and they don't know where to start. So similar to that concept in the previous slide, starting somewhere, rather than doing a complete in-depth analysis of each of your applications, we recommend starting small, run some basic security assessments of all of your applications that your organization controls or develops. And if you heard that and you're thinking, okay, that's even a lot to ask, narrow it down. Maybe focus first on applications that handle sensitive information and go from there. Keeping these basic scans focused on finding that low-hanging fruit that Andrew talked to, such as making sure, for example, that the Android debug flag isn't enabled before it goes to production, is a quick fix and high reward, because we find that oftentimes in production that debug flag is mistakenly left on and logs sensitive data to the device. So focus on that low-hanging fruit, making sure your iOS apps has globally enabled ATS, as Andrew mentioned. These are all excellent places to start. And while in-depth analysis is also important, it's always going to be important, many common and sometimes high-risk issues can be found using this quick scan approach. And just remember that it's always better to do something rather than nothing.
Great. So
All right.
we've got one last one.
Go ahead.
Nope, go ahead.
Let's move on to the fifth topic here, and it's really the risk in the App Store. When we look at the evolution of mobile today with 6 million apps in the Apple and Google Play stores, there's a whole vector here that can create millions of points of risk for the typical organization that you may not be recognizing are out there. So, Andrew, why don't you get us rolling here on our fifth and our last data point?
Yeah, and I'm going to make it super quick because I know we've already thrown a lot of content at you guys. But basically, everything that we've talked about to date is not only an issue for the apps that you're developing, but they're issues for apps that you're using within your enterprise. And if you look at a typical enterprise, there are tens of thousands of applications that are being used. And so you have to understand that there's an enormous amount of risk there, and you have to have controls in place to address that risk. Many apps expose sensitive data. Lots of folks are still transmitting without encryption. We're seeing a higher incidence of credentials being leaked inside business applications. So there's a lot of different statistics out there that really point to the, hey, even if you have your house in order, you can be exposed to tremendous risk within the third-party app store. And it's not only the apps in a one-time kind of, I've looked at it and I think I'm okay. They're constantly changing, and those can be introducing new flaws and new problems. So Katie will talk us through a couple of specific things you can do in the near term, thinking about that third-party risk in the App Store.
Yeah, if you haven't picked up on it yet, there is this theme here too, tackling the problem of quantifying mobile app risk at scale, whether it's risk of applications that you own or develop or risk of third-party applications used within your organization. And as we've discussed, it's just not possible to repeatedly perform manual analysis of every version for every app that you care about. So your risk assessment approach should really focus on three things: documentation of mobile apps, rapid scans of each of those apps, and more in-depth analysis for certain apps that handle highly sensitive information. Since our focus here on this slide is what can you do in the near term for third-party apps, we recommend this three-step approach for getting a handle on your organization's third-party app risk. The first step is to use your existing MDM solution in order to determine what are the top 20 or top 30 most commonly used applications in your organization today, and start with those. Take those apps, perform a quick scan, and identify risks as they relate to security, privacy, and compliance. Once those risks are identified, you'll want to determine the proper action in order to reduce that risk. So whether that's through some form of reconfiguration within the device, or perhaps even blacklisting the application, this action will depend on what threat scenarios are important to your organization. So for example, if your organization has strong concerns around employees or users connecting their devices to insecure Wi-Fi networks, you'll want to focus on those app vulnerabilities that relate to sending data unencrypted over the network. Once again, the theme here, the most important thing is to start small and expand from there. And Brian, if we switch to the next slide, we want to talk, in our 5 trends we discussed earlier, Andrew covered the surprising number of apps on the Play Store and the App Store that have high-risk flaws or expose sensitive data, as well as the importance of having visibility into the security, privacy, compliance posture of the apps installed on your employee devices. NowSecure Intel can provide that visibility, and we'd like you to see for yourself. We're offering a free security report on Apple App Store or Google Play Store apps of your choice, a single app of your choice. To request a report, please use the link that we've posted in the resources section of your BrightTalk interface, and we'll also include a link in the follow-up email that we send to you.
Excellent. Thanks, Katie, and thanks, Andrew, for the wrap-up here. What I'd like to do is summarize here, and then we're going to move into any remaining questions. So I'll remind people, please use the questions Q&A to ask us questions. So as we plow forward, NowSecure provides that 360-degree coverage. We've talked a lot about best practices here. We provide the tools and the platform to help you do much of the testing, monitoring, measurement, and iterative improvements in your organization. NowSecure Auto can plug into your SDLC for DevSecOps, NowSecure Intel to audit those third-party apps, NowSecure Workstation to give you the deep dive, and Katie's team in NowSecure Services can drive through automated expert pen testing on your behalf if you don't have the resources, as well as help you develop your own best practices and masked program, formal program in your organization. Now, as part of this, we have some other resources. We provide the Insider's Guide for Mobile App Security Program Management. That's also in your attachments and links. It's a great handbook authored by Katie, who runs our services team, and it's a great starting point to really formalizing your program. And as we talked about today, shifting left with the mobile AppSec factory, that's probably the biggest mega wave that's not just about 2017 or 2018, but beyond. And it's really the strategy about, thin testing, automated, rapid testing of everything to give you 100% coverage of every developed app running through your software development lifecycle. Plugged in, run in an automated fashion or on demand if you put a person inside of it. Now, again, you can run through and get deeper certification, right? So let's say that you do your rapid test, but then you want a deeper certification for pre-release, or you're looking for very specific compliance components. You get hands-on with NowSecure Workstation. And if anything isn't right, you can pass strong, well-identified recommendations, identified code snippets back to engineering so they can quickly adapt and resolve those issues fast. And then, of course, the same factory line that comes in from your third-party Appstore. Most organizations, they say the typical number of apps is somewhere between 50 and 90. And so you really should audit all those apps, as we talked about today. And with our Intel product, you can automatically test and monitor those apps for change over time. So this overall strategy of shifting left allows you to cover broadly with the lowest possible effort, cost, and time, and then do deep testing as necessary for your higher risk components. Now, as part of this, we have, of course, a reference document for you as well. So the TAL Mobile App Dev SecOps, we encourage you to take a look at that as you're considering that strategy. And finally, coming soon, if you're in California or coming to AppSec Cali, we'll look forward to seeing you there. If you're in DC, coming to ShmooCon, we'll be there as well. Look forward to catching up with you there as part of the journey. And so finally, we're right at the end game here. I'm going to see, is there anything else?
There's one last question. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, the question was about can we test apps in a foreign app store? And the answer to that is generally yes. It's not built fully into the product per se. We do some foreign app stores. We also have the ability to pull the apps down and just kind of run them through the system. Sometimes different languages and how they handle prompts can introduce some challenges, but we've had some success there. So if you have specific questions, follow up with us. There's a slide here at the very end that will have our contact info, and we'll get you guys some answers.
All right, and with that, I'd like to thank everyone for joining us today. We look forward to meeting you in the marketplace. This information has been recorded. We'll be providing you with the links, a follow-up recording, and the slides. Thanks again. Have a great end of 2017, and we'll see you in 2018. Goodbye now.